Do you want to know how to talk to a child about inappropriate touching? That is a touchy subject, but it is possible to have a good conversation about it. I'm Nicholeen Peck, and I teach all over the world about parenting, good communication, how to build strong family bonds, child development, and education, all through the lens of the principle self-government. And in this video, we're going to be talking about how to teach self-government about touching yourself. In this video, we'll talk a little bit about touching yourself and stimulation, sexual stimulation like that, and why children fall into that. And then we'll talk about how to breach the subject and make sure that you have a healthy, safe, calm, productive conversation that isn't shaming, but helps a person learn that they can have some self-mastery, even over a craving that seems so intense. I teach all over the world, and so people ask me to teach at some pretty high-profile places. I teach at the UN a lot, actually, trying to bring awareness to a lot of family issues there. And one year at the United Nations, I was actually teaching about sexual issues related to children and parental rights related to teaching those things, especially related to schools, that kind of stuff, and how the parents should get involved with that teaching. After I was done with the teaching, there was a young woman, probably in her maybe early 20s. She might have even been in her late teens. And she was there with some other people, you know, just kind of watching and seeing what was going on at the United Nations that day. And she happened to be at the event where I was speaking. And she came up to me afterward and said, well, you know, why is touching yourself, I mean, she used the word masturbation, why is that so bad? I don't think that's so bad. I think it's healthy. I think it's good, you know, that kind of thing. And I said, listen, I'm not saying that people don't do it. I'm not saying it's going to kill somebody. I'm not saying that, you know, a person is bad if they happen to have tried that at some point. But what I am saying is that it's addictive, okay? And it's very addictive. And she's like, no, I can totally control that. And I said, I want you to think about it because it sounds like you're engaged in that behavior. I said, I want you to think about it. Does it ever call to you? Does the craving call to you? If it does, then it is an addiction that is controlling you. And I believe in freedom. And I believe in teaching my children how to have freedom. I don't want them to be addicted to anything throughout their lives. And when people become sex addicts, they don't respect themselves. They put themselves in danger. Especially females can end up in a lot of danger. She just kind of looked at me in surprise. She didn't know what to say. But I know she had never considered that before. She had never considered that it was calling to her, that she was in bondage to that. And so that right there hopefully segues into this idea of self-governing yourself related to self-touching. When children are little babies, they touch themselves all over. They don't know what they're doing. They're like, whoa, what was that? Like, how did I get my hand there? You know, I don't even know, right? And it just happens. When children are toddlers and you're toilet training them and they're like, whoa, what do I got going on here, right? And they reach into their diapers and different things. And that's all just like, who am I and what are my bits and pieces, right? And how do I work? And that kind of stuff. That is stuff that I'm not overly concerned about with a child, but I'm not going to allow them to just keep touching themselves, okay? So they may find their bits and pieces, but then I give them a no answer about it and say, oh, that's a no answer. We don't touch ourselves. So let's say we're in the bathtub and suddenly they start doing something to themselves, then I'm going to say, oh, that's a no. We don't touch our bodies like that. We have special bodies, and we need to keep our special bodies very sacred, and we need to respect them. They're not toys. I tell them that's a no answer and that they need to say okay and not do that. Now, obviously, if they didn't accept that no answer as a small child, I would correct them for that. And I talk in other videos on this channel about how to do corrections for any type of behavior, but that would be them not accepting a no answer, right? That's when they're tiny, but when they get a little bit older, when they start doing it. Now it's like, okay, now we're into an addiction, right? When you hit your teens and the hormones are firing and everything else, I'm pretty sure every boy tries it once. They would have to. Girls, maybe not so much, but more so now because our culture is so sexualized. So you have to have self-touching, self-stimulation conversations with girls and boys, not just with boys. I think it used to be that parents would only have those conversations with boys because girls by and large were just kind of like the modest, like, I'm not doing anything like that. Like they wouldn't even think of it. But our society is different now, and the thoughts do get presented. They get suggested to everyone in lots of different ways, and our culture is much more sexual. Plus, you know what? Anyone can be titillated, which is, you know, aroused, and the girls and boys alike. So you have to have those conversations. At the time when they're older, you just say, hey, listen, okay, anyone can get aroused, titillated, you know, start feeling kind of a sexual craving or feeling. It might feel kind of like this, or you might say, have you had that before? Like, you know, this is no big deal to talk about this, just so you know. I'm not going to be shocked by anything. I would expect you've had feelings like that before, maybe even dreams like that or something like that. And they might be like, oh my word, this is so awkward. I can't believe we're having this conversation. And just say, you know, I know, but I just want to make sure that we've had this conversation, because occasionally we might, you know, just kind of check up and see how you're doing. Then they might not want to offer up a ton, but I might say something like, listen, it's actually a normal thing that somebody might, you know, do that, but it's also a very addictive thing. It fires certain chemicals in your brain. I would start talking to them about what does happen in the brain, the different dopamine releases, and you know, all of the hormones and the after effects of like the melatonin and the GABA and all the things that happen within your brain when you engage in that self-stimulation, and then you have that hormonal release that occurs, because they really want to just know how they work, okay? And you might have to share with them some things like, hey, you know, this has a purpose. Its purpose is, you know, that when you're when you're married, when you're having sexual relations with people and you're creating children, and, you know, this is part of the process there, right? And so you would explain, this is why we have bodily fluids and all these different things. Don't get so graphic, but let them know enough, right? Before they get married, tell them absolutely every single thing, or before they're ever going to engage in sexual activity. But make sure that they know enough that it's more than their teacher would have said at school, or it's more than the friend would have said, so that you're the authority. You need to be the authority first on this. Be completely calm, comfortable about it. Don't be odd or uncomfortable, because that just makes the whole thing rough for them. But you explain those things, and then you set up boundaries and say, okay, well, so do you think you might be having a hard time with that? Why do you think you might be having a hard time with that? Hopefully they would open up with you and say, okay, well, let's just make some goals for ourselves. Let's have a daily check-in, or let's have a weekly check-in, see how you're doing and if things have improved. What thought can you tell yourself at the time that you think about doing that? Maybe you can think, I need to go for a run, or I need to go do my chores. I need to go do something physical and active, because when you do something physical, that can also get you a nice little endorphin release. It's not as significant and as huge as if you had a sexual release, but it is something that will help you hopefully get the idea out of your mind. And you can tell yourself things in your head like, nope, this is a no answer. I need to drop the subject. So there are 4 basic skills of self-government. Those 4 basic skills are following instructions, accepting no answers and criticism, accepting consequences, and disagreeing appropriately. You really need accepting no answers and following instructions in order to conquer an addiction like this. So what you would do is teach them how to give themselves a no answer, which there's 4 steps to that, and then you would teach them how to give themselves an instruction for something else to do in the moment instead of obeying that first thought that was in their head. Because when they get a craving that feels like an instruction for the body, they have to be told no, know how to drop the subject, And they have to tell themselves no because they're the only ones that know that it's happening in their head. And then they need to give themselves an instruction to go do something else so that they don't follow down that path. The more times they can break themselves away from following that craving and that path, the more they will feel that sense of freedom, self-accomplishment, empowerment, and they will get further and further away from that addiction so that it doesn't become a problem for them forever. That said, sexual addictions, especially self-pleasuring addictions like that, are really hard to break. They can be these lingering addictions where it's like, you know, somebody got into a habit of doing it for a while, then they pull away from it. All of a sudden, like months later or a year later, it's like suddenly they're tempted with it and they don't know why. So, and it could be hormonally related. There's all kinds of issues that could cause that to occur, but they just need to know always to be on their guard. And if they have a plan, how to accept a no answer, how to follow an instruction in those cases, they will be more successful. So I'm starting to talk about a few self-government things here. We've touched on how to pre-teach about self-touching. We've touched on a little bit that we might have to do a correction. Well, what does that mean? There's steps to that. We've talked about skills, how to accept a no answer, and a few steps to that skill, and following an instruction, which has 5 steps to that skill. There's so many more things that we could discuss about how to set up an environment where your children can really be great at self-governing themselves, self-mastery in any circumstance, including these sexual cravings. I would like to give you more information about that. There is another video on this channel. It's called The Not So Known Secret for Parenting Success. It will go into more details about those skills so that you can start doing self-government at your house.